if you're able to say something and he's able to show that he's understood it, you have communicated in a way that is using the abstract tool of language to enter that world of intelligence. Well, to join minds, essentially, that's really what it's about.
Hey guys, I'm R Olson, and welcome to another episode of the Synapse series on Science-Centric. Synapse is our signature discussion series where we have thought-provoking discussions with scientists, journalists, authors, and other thought leaders. But before we dive in, a couple of quick reminders. One, you can help keep this series going by liking this episode, subscribing to the channel, and clicking on that little notification bell to be informed when new episodes go live. And number two, you can help support us directly through Patreon. We have a couple of nice benefits over there, including early access to new episodes, ad-free episodes, and a monthly patrons-only Q&A with me where you can suggest new show topics or guests. Check out the YouTube description or visit sciencecentric.com/support for more info. Simon Prentis, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on and for getting in touch. It's awesome to have you here, and I think we're very lucky to have you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So I typically have, I typically write this intro for guests, but I had a great idea from a viewer that's like, you should just let the guests introduce themselves. So I think we'll do that here. So maybe you could just tell the listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you became a book author.
All right. Well, that could be potentially a long story, but I guess the way into that would be to say that I've always been, since my late teens, I've always been interested in other cultures and just sort of different ways of thinking about the world, and mainly due to a dissatisfaction with my own, I think. And so I sort of traveled quite a bit in my youth, mainly in the Middle East and Europe. But then when I went to university, I wasn't really doing anything to do with languages particularly. I studied literature and language, and then I became involved in a martial art called Aikido, which you may or may not know.
Yes.
Japanese. Yeah. Okay. More of an art than a martial, as I like to say, if you still have me. Anyway, I decided I had to go to Japan, so I managed to wangle a way to get to Japan. And I originally thought I was going to be there for about a year, and then I realized that wouldn't even scratch the surface of it. And I began to learn the language to my surprise, because I hadn't been a linguist at school or university. And one thing led to another, and I ended up staying there 8 years and qualifying as a translator and an interpreter. And then I came back to Europe and, based in London, started working as an interpreter and translator through many European countries and the Middle East, and also in America and other places. I've traveled quite widely and seen a lot of cultures firsthand, and the overriding thing that really bothered me, I guess, was how self-centered everybody is in their own culture. They all become convinced that theirs is the best,
of course,
and that everybody else is somehow substandard. And particularly in the English-speaking world, we're so kind of, it's not even dismissive, it's just plain flat ignorant of other cultures.
Right.
And we sort of kind of treat somebody who doesn't speak English properly as somehow mentally defective. And this is different to other cultures where, because of the dominance of English, if you make the effort to speak their language, they're generally very happy that you do that. It's a very sort of one-sided position that the English-speaking world takes. But nonetheless, and notwithstanding, each culture does have this secret belief that it is somehow really special and has these really special things that no other culture has. So I kind of the idea was to write a book that would look at those cultural issues.
Yeah.
And why it is that we end up in those sort of kind of rather blinkered positions. And then, because I'm obviously a linguist, I became more interested in the nature of language and words. And I discovered that really nobody knows. That language is a bit of a mystery. We all know that language is the one thing that distinguishes us, but we don't really know why. And so I started researching that, and then I ran into a piece of research that kind of opened a door for me when I realized that the number of sounds that we use when we speak, what normally people think of as vowels and consonants, or the pros call phonemes, that these are different numbers for different languages. And not only that, they can get quite small. The further away you get from Africa down into the jungles of South America, people are only using 11 phonemes, right? Now, in English, it's something like 44, and in other languages, it's even higher than that.
And a phoneme is basically like the most basic sound that we make, right? It's like it would be a p sound or a duh sound or anything that was.
That's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of what we think of as vowels and consonants. It's like a generic word for all of the sounds that we use. And people who don't really think about language very much don't really know that, but actually we are using a very limited number of sounds. It's just everything we're saying can be diced down into those small number of sounds. It's like numbers, really. The numbers, we have just 10 digits, and we can use those 10 digits to make any number we like. And words are the same, basically.
So let me jump in and kind of highlight this point that you're making, which is that, and by the way, should mention the book is called Speech: How Language Made Us Human. If that hasn't been covered, which is your book that came out, I think, about a year ago. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. And I just issued an updated version. Yeah.
So that, the thing about language, and maybe a podcast actually is the best sort of vehicle for talking about language. But I had that thought as I was kind of getting ready to speak with you. But we're born into it. We learn language from such a young age, and it's so much a part of what we do that it's almost like a fish. I was thinking like a fish swimming in water. It's like you don't.
Yeah, totally.
We never take that time to really think about, well, what are we actually doing? Because we're so focused on the meaning of what we say, but and it's instantly translated, but we don't think about like those little individual noises that we're making that somehow translate
Absolutely
into.
Not.
So I think that's what you're getting at there. Yeah.
Well, the really interesting thing about that to me is that even the professionals don't really think about that, because humans have been thinking about, well, some humans have been thinking about language as far back as we have records. In ancient Greece, obviously, but in India, it goes back. People who studied grammar go back thousands of years, and it's all been about, well, how does this thing work? What are the rules that make language work? And so moving into the modern age, you have Chomsky, who really took that to the nth degree and started applying computational techniques so that you've got these really complicated trees of, recursive subclauses and all that stuff, and it gets very complex. But that's not the actual base of language. That's the kind of the superstructure, if you like. Yeah. When you drill down in it, what is the really key thing that makes us different from other animals is the fact that we have lots of words. I mean, words come before grammar. That seems to be the thing that people somehow miss. Words are taken for granted. And, if you speak another language, I don't know, but if you've ever tried to learn one, obviously you start with individual words. And only later on do you start to put the grammar together, because you don't have enough words to do it to begin with.
Right.
And the difference between what we do and what other animals do is that because we put sounds together, we can make lots of words very easily. Whereas most animals just make one noise like woof or moo or whatever they do. And they haven't got much choice here. So it's not surprising they don't use grammar. And when people talk about what's the difference between animal communication and human language, they're usually talking about grammar. They say, well, they don't do grammar. But of course they don't do grammar. They haven't got words. It's a much more basic thing than that. So that was really the starting point of my book, was to point that out. It's just, all we're doing is just like grunting at each other, but in a structured fashion.
now I won't be able to continue talking. I mean, that's a little bit how
You're too conscious of what you're doing.
yeah, you start focusing on that. I mean, it's a little bit like, you're on some kind of hallucinogen and you start focusing on the sounds of, like, I can't talk because I'm listening to the sound of my own voice, kind of thing, like a self-consciousness, which we can't do. Which actually might actually be a good, that might be a segue into talking about language and self and consciousness, or being, I don't know if conscience conscious and self-conscious, are those related? I'm trying to think.
Self-consciousness.
Yeah. I don't know. So anyways, sorry, lost my train of thought. But so a major premise of your book is that language is actually a construction of our, it kind of constructs our consciousness. And one question I had for you about that is just, did your involvement in Japanese culture bring out that idea for you? Because, I mean, to me, that sounds a lot like, and we actually have a bit of a connection here, because I've studied Chinese martial arts for a long time and been, I was doing Tai Chi, which is very, kind of has a lot of the same, precepts that Aikido does, but it's also heavily influenced by Taoism and Zen. And there's this idea that, well, let me let you answer the question. But do you think your involvement in Japanese culture, contributed to this idea that you're putting forward in the book, that language actually is our consciousness?
Yes.
Consciousness.
Okay. Yeah. Well, there's two parts to that. Maybe first of all, yes, I think so. I think certainly my practice of Zen, not that it was hugely deep, but as a sort of ancillary to doing Aikido, you kind of get into that. And meditation, Zen meditation is as much as anything sort of trying to shut off the stream of words that's going through your head, to stop the thoughts that are coming through, and just sort of be there. And so once you do that, then you sort of realize that you have a huge amount of sensory information that's there that is often just obscured and blocked out by words. Because what we're doing now, I mean, we're talking to each other, and I'm actually with you wherever you are, somehow in my mind. I'm not in my own space here. If I do that, then I'm not with you anymore. I'm here. But actually, when I'm talking to you, because of the illusion, the abstract world that words create, I'm no longer here. So doing meditation, I think, really made me see that contrast between what I in the book call awareness and consciousness. And I make a distinction between those two, and I think that's not widely sort of made. And what I mean by that is, you can be aware of things, but you can't necessarily have a word for them. You don't necessarily have words to them. It's when you have a word that you can start thinking about things. And it's difficult to really... there's that famous quote that I quote in my book from Thomas Hobbes, saying, "Words are wise men's counters. They do but reckon with them, but they are the currency of fools." Meaning, you kind of need a word. You need words to be able to think about things in a complex way.
Yeah.
But if you get trapped in words, it's the currency of fools, because actually all you have is your awareness. And that's what all animals share. All animals have an awareness. And probably, even if one to go to the extreme, maybe even rust has awareness. You've got iron and water come together, and they want to be together in the form of rust. Maybe they're aware of that at some level. Maybe there's a feeling that pulls them like that. That's the real basic awareness.
Right.
But they don't have any means of bringing that to consciousness. Whereas we do. What language has done has allowed us to be aware that we are aware, because we can put a noise that we agree means something and share that. And then once you've got that word, then you can use it to think. Sorry, I'm probably not explaining this very well. But
No, I think, I mean, I think, yeah, I think it comes back. It makes sense especially if you've read any Buddhism or, Zen Buddhism or Taoism or anything like that.
yeah,
It's this idea of they think they call it the monkey mind, is the phrase in Zen. It's this, kind of chattering, this voice that's always going in our head and talking and labeling things. And, maybe Freud called it the ego. It's the, and the id is more of our just raw awareness or, drives that we can't really name. But, in Buddhism or Taoism, you meditate to quiet that chattering monkey mind and just go into pure awareness. So
I make a distinction in the book between the id entity and identity, which I have to.
Right.
A friend of mine told me that, and I'm afraid I shamelessly stole it because I think it's a great idea. The idea that your identity is this artificial construction that you have in your head, which is all to do with the culture you were brought up in, and the language that you learn, and the religion that surrounded that, and all those things that give you your cultural identity. But nested inside that is the id entity that wants to break out and doesn't like really being trapped in this sort of cultural armor.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a different way of saying what you're saying, really.
Yeah.
So the purpose of meditation is.
Yeah. So this idea that you're putting forward is that, if I understand it, that language is this great tool that humans developed, that can do all these great things, but then we're also sort of trapped by it. So how are we trapped by language? Okay. What are the traps that we can fall into?
Well, the traps are the answers to the questions that we have. The way the book is structured is that I look at, first of all, explain how we come to be able to do this, the trick of language, as we were just talking about, putting sounds together. So then that allows you to have a conversation. So obviously the first set of conversations you start to have is, how are we going to do things here? What are the ways we're going to, if you and I are going to sort of set up some kind of life together, we're going to have to make some practical decisions about how you do things. So that means discussing it and coming up with answers, and you come to those answers. And most of the time, those answers will just be things you happen to discover along the way, and maybe a way to make fire, or, best way to arrange things in your life. And I talk about just things like dividing time. How are we going to talk about time? Things like that. It's very, there's a lot of very practical things that soon come up once you have language, as opposed to having no language. No animals can talk about time because they don't have the words to it. They can't say, I'll Zoom with you next Wednesday at 6:00. That's not going to happen because too many questions involved that they haven't answered. So you get a whole set of decisions that you and I have made, our little culture, and other people will come to other decisions about how they're going to do it, maybe. Let's just take the example of time, which I use in the book. Every culture comes up with different decisions about, when does a day start? How long is a week?
Oh, yeah.
How many hours do you have in a day? All that kind of stuff. So we get to, we think our way is the right way. So we get stuck with that. That's what tradition is all about. It's about believing that the answers your culture came up with must be the right ones, because here we are. We will learn. So that's the first trap. In a sense, it's the answer to the question, how. Once you can start asking the question, how, you got to answer it. And the answer can become a trap. And likewise, the next question, sort of big question that comes along, is why.
Right.
Why are we here? What's going on? And in a sense, religion is the first answer to the question, why? Because there's a whole set of stories that get told.
Yeah.
And right through. Go on.
Well, let's dwell in how a little bit here.
Okay.
So one thing that I think that a lot of actually Americans take great pleasure in is noticing all the little differences between British English and American English. They're both English, and to be fair, the English invented English. Okay, so you may have a bit more of
it. We stole it from other people. That's
well, that's true. That's a whole other can of worms. But it's almost like being a bit. It's almost like you feel like it's a bit of a parallel universe when you're comparing all these things. You're like, how could you? I remember going to the grocery store, and I worked for Nature Publishing, which is based in the UK. So a lot of my colleagues were British, and I was over there, and we went to the grocery store, and we're talking about the woman I was with. She was talking about the trolley. Oh, and you get the trolley to pick up groceries, and here we call it grocery cart. We don't call it a trolley. I thought, it's just it's so funny, but like, as you're saying, there's no real, is there any benefit to calling one versus the other? I mean,
you should try taking a deep dive into another language, because that confusion that you're talking about is multiplied in so many different dimensions. It's like, oh my God, it's a wonderful experience. Just on trolley, I can't help mentioning this, but that is the current term of abuse for our Prime Minister, trolley. He's referred to as a trolley because, you go into a shopping mall and you take a cart in the American sense. Yeah. And, one of the wheels is weird and it just won't go in the direction that you want it to go in. Right? So that is the current term of abuse for our wonderful Prime Minister. And it's very true. Trolley. But clearly hasn't got over the pond because nobody would understand it in America.
And we do have that word. We do have trolley, but it refers to a streetcar that you would ride on, like a cable car in San Francisco.
Which we call a tram.
Yes.
We call that a tram.
Yeah. So it's like I don't know. I just find that really fun and entertaining to compare
and then
those things.
Then this whole thing ratchets up then, because the next stage is why, as I was saying. So you get your religion, your little religion, and I just read this wonderful thing that who was it? I just remember what it was. The book by Matt Ridley, who was an interesting character. Anyway, he said that there's this fantastic, I'm sure you know it, on the Sistine Chapel in Rome. There's this portrait by Michelangelo showing God creating man. It's like God and Adam are touching fingers. It's a very sort of dramatic image, and it's always taken to mean, that this is the moment that God created man. And he suggests in the book that actually, no, it's the other way around, because anybody who has any sense of the history of religion must know that there are so many different options here that none of them can be right. And actually, the truth is that Adam is creating man. And if you look at that picture again and think of it that way around, that actually Adam touching God's finger is creating God.
Right.
It opens up a whole different universe.
Right.
But my point is there that the next set of things that we get trapped by, going back to your question about how does language trap us, is that set of questions. What's the answer to why we're here? Because everybody has a different solution to that. And it might just be that your version is right, but the other logical solution is that they're all wrong.
I mean, that's I could see how that's certainly a trap.
So moving on from that, then the question becomes, what do you do about this? What do you do about the fact that you're saying, cart and I'm saying trolley, or you're measuring things in miles and I'm using kilometers, or all these things, and you say, well, your God made the universe, and I'm saying, no, my God did. How do you deal with that? And the answer, which is really to the point of science centric, is science, the scientific approach.
Right.
is the one where you leap over all those things and you come together at a higher level where you're actually able to apply a scientific method, which is really just logic and really just sort of kind of putting all the arguments together and seeing how they stack up. And that's, that is the great joy of language, is sort of being able to use it as a tool to bring you closer to an understanding of what's going on, basically, I suppose.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to bring up was that reading your book, and I read a review of it, and one of the things the review said was it's kind of in the tradition of the book, which I absolutely adore, which is Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and also Sapiens, which I actually I haven't finished that, but I started reading it. But it's like language is so fundamental to everything that we do that it really like constructs our entire culture, right? I mean, this is how we get this complexity of culture, because religion can be very complex. Theology can be very complex.
Yeah. Very.
Science, of course, is very complex. It involves logic and everything. I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I think it's. I think your book has a very, very large scope. So in some ways, it's, it's kind of a history of humanity and our relationship with language, and then it's, all the things that we do really have this relationship with language. I mean, that's really right. I mean, that's
why the subtitle. I mean, it's called Speech, and speech with an exclamation mark. So it's not really just about speech. It's about how we get to be how we are. I mean, the subtitle is the thing. How language made us human.
Yeah.
Because any species, what I'm trying to say is that any species that was able to talk or share information, detailed information in the way that language allows us to do, is going to run up against these questions. And it's the fact that we were able to do that turns us into what we are. I mean, every culture has a culture, and has a religion of some form or more than one religion,
right?
And has an identity, and all these things are a necessary consequence of language. And then over and above that, if we're lucky, we get some science that allows us to kind of sort out the truth from the not truth,
right?
The fact from the fantasy.
Right.
That's the hope behind it, and then that has consequences in turn, because the technology then grows, and that allows us to connect up in ways that we never could. I mean, just what we're doing now is a miracle of technology. From when I was a kid.
Oh right.
That we could be doing it was just insane.
Oh yeah. Even from when I was a kid, and I'm I think a bit younger. But yeah. I mean, it's unfathomable, really.
Yeah. So even though language has kind of splintered into all these different varieties, and we have these astonishingly, different ways of looking at the world and thinking about the world, the technology is bringing us all back together again, and we're all really sort of now able to be back on the same page in ways that haven't through history, and that in a sense gives us hope that we're going to get past the kind of thing that's going on in Ukraine, for example, which is just essentially insane in the 21st century.
Is there, just to back up a little bit into, is there any evidence that other animal species have anything similar to us in terms of language? I know that, for example, like chimpanzees and some birds do have some level of culture, things that, ideas or concepts that they can pass on about finding food and more basic activities like that. But is there any evidence that other species do language? Maybe not on the same level that we do, but
yeah, not a great deal. But that's partly and probably mostly because we haven't really been looking for it, or maybe even more so, we haven't had the tools to analyze it. And I think it's now, there's just recently been some very interesting research published about chimpanzees and showing that even though we previously thought they could only make a very limited number of noises, they've shown that there's up to about 400 words, they call them words, I mean, by which they mean putting noises together to allow them to increase their vocabulary, just like numbers, the way that I argue in my book. So that's a very interesting thing, because it shows that what humans have done in what I say digitizing noise and making language is actually something that other animals have started doing in different ways. So up until now, everybody's thought that language, one of the mysteries of language is why only humans? How come humans have this power to think in recursive nested dependencies and all this kind of Chomskyan stuff, and no other animal can do it? That's crazy. Why? But actually now, if you reduce it back down to the basics, you can see that other animals are doing it. And that, it's still very primitive, but then these things, evolution happens over millions of years. It doesn't happen over your lifetime and my lifetime. So we've taken language, and language, once it catches fire, once you've got the idea of putting words together, then over a quite short space of time, even then probably a million years, you're going to start getting a hockey stick of, very rapid development.
Yeah.
And I think that's why humans are so far ahead of the game, is that once it takes off, it really takes off. Whereas other animals haven't maybe got to that stage yet.
Now, you mentioned in the book this chimp, I think a bonobo chimp named Kanzi.
Kanzi, yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that? And this is what you're referring to when you talk about chimps able to make to learn something like 400 words. And you said something interesting about this chimp, that it sort of ceased to be a bonobo once it started to learn language. So what do you mean by that exactly?
What I meant by that was that, the interesting thing about, they've tried for many years, going back to the 30s, to teach language to the great apes, mainly chimps, but also gorillas and other animals. And they've never really had much success with it. They've managed to teach them some sign language, but they never really kind of got it to the point where they felt that they'd been able to grasp it. Now, the Kanzi's mother was one of the subjects of these experiments, and they were trying to teach her words, and she was having a lot of trouble. And then I think when she was selected, that's what it was. When she was selected for the research, they didn't know she was pregnant. But they just sort of started into it, and they realized that she was pregnant, so they had to carry on with it. And so she had the baby while she was doing, part of the testing to teach her language. And after about 3 years, they just gave up with her because she just wasn't making any progress. And they sort of stopped. But then Kanzi, who'd been watching the whole thing, and they hadn't been teaching him, he'd just been hanging around with his mother, he suddenly started using the interface board that they had, and showed that he had actually grasped the things that his mother couldn't grasp. And so then they worked with him, and he was eventually able to understand quite complicated sentences, like, would you pick that television up and take it outside the room, something like that. There's one that sticks in my head. If you go onto YouTube, you can see it, that he's being told things that are, it's not quantum physics, but it is, complicated interactions with reality that are just spoken to him, and he understands it.
And it's not just some repetitive task that he's done and recognizes the sound of the words. Like the researchers are actually putting together sentences that he does not know, so he has to comprehend the new construction of the sentence.
Yeah. That's absolutely right. And
that's amazing.
And there's a sort of, there are also videos of him. He was taught how to make a fire, and he could make a bonfire and cook marshmallows on a stick and eat them. And he again, basic stuff. But if you're able to say something and he's able to do, to show that he's understood it, then that's kind of one of us, That's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
You have communicated in a way that is using the abstract tool of language to enter that world of intelligence. Well, to join minds, essentially, that's really what it's about.
Yeah.
I mean, again, go back to humans in the context of going into a foreign culture, that a language you don't speak, you're cut off. You just, people just come up to you and say things, and you can't understand what they mean.
Yeah.
There's no way in.
Yeah.
But when you learn the language, then you're in, and then you've joined, the human aspect of that culture. So by Kanzi mastering some of those aspects of language, he became one of us. I mean, in the same way that somebody who can speak a little bit of your language is one of you, in the way that somebody who can't speak any language.
So it's really that you're, and you said this a few times, but that it's like language you sort of enter into this abstract space together. We're having this conversation. Yeah. We're having this conversation across the Atlantic Ocean. We're inhabiting this space, which of course is supported by, technology and video and all of that. So we do have some nonverbal communication going on, but we're inhabiting. If we were on the phone, especially, and we couldn't see each other, we'd be inhabiting this verbal sort of mental world that's sort of separated from our actual awareness.
Totally.
Right? I mean, that's such a cool way to think about it. Actually, I think that's fascinating.
In the book, I talk about language being or books, for example, being our first form of television. Because if you have a good book, a novel, you're reading it, you go totally into it, and in your head, you're seeing it all. It's just like television. And when it's a book, you go, oh yeah, well, it's a book, but actually we're doing it just all the time with language.
Yeah.
I'm giving you ideas, and you're bouncing back ideas to me, and we're in that sort of conceptual world of sharing, an abstract space, and being able to then sort of move within it by manipulating sound. It's the most incredible thing.
Yeah.
And as you said at the beginning, we're completely unaware of it. Because once you're in it, you don't realize.
Well, I'm a Star Trek fan, so I'm going to start calling it subspace, because that sounds like it reminds me of that. It's like we're having there's this channel of communication that. This chimp, I mean, this is just fascinating. So this chimp learns our language, and now that chimp is sort of inhabiting that with his caretakers, these researchers. My question about that.
He also, by the way, very quickly, he also taught his sister, because he learned some sign language, and they right. And again, this is very primitive, but the bigger point is, which I also make in the book, that it's not that other animals aren't intelligent. They are intelligent, but they don't have a way to share that intelligence. So they're kind of cut off in their own worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one of the issues about the evolution of the human is that we have these big brains that seem to be too big for us. I mean, in terms of other animals, where our brains are 3 times bigger than a chimpanzee in terms of, brain-body ratios. So conventionally, the thinking in linguistic circles is that, and even in Sapiens, you may remember at the beginning of Sapiens, he repeats it, is that, so, our brains just got bigger, and then one day they were ready for language, and we were able to speak. There was a conceptual revolution, whatever that means, and we were one day able to speak. So, okay, why did our brains get bigger? I don't know. Maybe, well, they just did, Whereas I would like to turn that on its head and say, we actually, because we learnt, even at a very primitive level, at the level of Kanzi, the bonobo, how to start exchanging ideas, then that puts the premium on intelligence, because the smartest members of the community can share their ideas, and the smarter you are, that doesn't just benefit you as an individual, it benefits the whole community.
Right.
So suddenly there's an evolutionary pressure to get smarter. So, over, again, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, it makes sense for a language-enabled community to develop bigger brains. And then that really puts you ahead of the game, because, the smart, and we've actually reached the limit for ourselves if you think about it. I mean, other animals can give birth quite easily, but it's quite tricky for humans to give birth, especially unaided, because our heads are so goddamn big. In fact, they're so big that we actually have to give birth prematurely in terms of animal terms, in order that our brains can grow outside the womb, because they're just so enormously huge. I mean, there must have been a really, really, really powerful reason for wanting to do that, for that being evolutionary acceptable. And the easiest answer to that is language. Otherwise, how do you explain it?
I'm laughing because I just had the thought that we're sort of marsupials almost just for our brains, right? Like marsupial mammals are born very premature, but for us, it's not the rest of our body. It's just for our heads.
Yeah, just for our heads. Yeah. Because, again, the point I make in the book is that, we went from being really powerful. I mean, a male chimpanzee is a pretty mean bastard.
Oh, yeah.
If you were with a hungry chimp fighting over something, he'd eat you, There's no way that an unarmed human could fight with a chimpanzee.
They're incredibly strong.
How come? But we know also that we evolved from that. So why did we become physically weaker? Why is that evolutionary, sort of a smart strategy, unless we had something to compensate for it?
Yeah.
Well, if we had language and we were able to work together in groups and plan strategies and hunt and do things using that incredible ability to communicate in the abstract world, then you wouldn't need to be individually strong, because, it would be better to put the effort into having a smarter brain. That's kind of what seems to have happened.
So let me just play devil's advocate for a second on that, because as I was thinking about that, but I mean, couldn't you say that wolves and other, say, orca whales that hunt in packs similarly have that ability in terms of?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you could argue actually that orcas do have language, so that maybe actually reinforces your point. But I'm not sure about wolves.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I mean, you see group activity amongst other animals as well. And I'm not saying that you can't have group activity without language. I'm just saying that if you have language, your ability to leverage that group activity is just sort of exponentially different.
Yeah.
I mean, you can hunt in a groups because you sort of get the idea of like circling around a fish so that you corral them into a corner. That's kind of you can sort of teach that on almost a visual way. It's sort of just watch me and do the same kind of thing. But you can't say, well, as I said earlier, let's meet next Wednesday around the back of that cliff and we'll hang out and you just wait there and I'll drive the fish out and then you grab, that kind of stuff. Definitely not happening.
Yeah.
And that's why, you could say maybe they do to some extent have language, but you can tell from their behavior that they don't have a sophisticated capacity for communication, because if they did, they would behave differently.
Yeah.
There is, as you said, some kind of group behavior going, but it's very, very limited.
Yeah. Well, and, I suppose if you looked at, I think whales are particularly interesting because they do have, pretty, as far as animals go, pretty sophisticated communication. They are the top predators of the ocean. I mean, they do have that advantage. So, maybe given a couple more million, years, they would develop something that would be on par with human communication. I'm just
Who knows? Maybe if they came back on land again, because they originally came from the land. That's the really kind of weird thing about whales. What was so bad about being on land that they had to go to the sea and develop? That must have been really hot and dry and miserable on the land at that time.
Okay, so to put it in sort of, I don't know how you would say it. Dawkinsian terms. Richard, Richard Dawkins, famous geneticist.
Yeah. Okay.
He talked in his book, The Selfish Gene, about memes. So it sounds like your kind of hypothesis, if you will, is that, memes sort of drove genes. So that, having these language skills, no matter how rudimentary, sort of drove genetic evolution towards bigger brains so that we could get better at making memes and, kind of, I guess you could almost look at it as like a virtuous circle sort of scenario.
Yes.
Where,
absolutely a virtuous circle. Yeah.
Whereas sorry, let me just finish the thought. So whereas, other research or other ideas about it have been sort of that there's the genes sort of just appeared, there was some kind of mutation that conferred this ability to speak. Yeah. And the most classic one being the one that I've heard the most about is this FOXP2 gene, I think it's called, and that we have, or a variant of that chimpanzees don't have. And we're like really closely related to chimps. I mean, we're basically hairless, big brain chimps. But so am I characterizing that correctly? And
yes, I mean, in terms of specifically the selfish gene, the final chapter of the original book talks about memes. That's where he coined the word meme, which obviously has become a bit hijacked in the last 30, 40 years. But nonetheless, the idea was that it was a unit of cultural transmission. That was how he defined it. Basically an idea, if you want to simplify it. So, and I think the last sentence of the book says something like that memes are what liberate us from the tyranny of our genes. Because the whole notion of the selfish gene is that basically, we're just vehicles for genes, and genes are just sort of doing their thing, and it's all about survival, and we have to be the vehicle for that, which is plausible, explanation for most of nature. However, humans are different. Why are they different? Well, as he says right at the end of the book, it's about memes. So, in a sense, my book is just an expanded version of that last chapter. And in fact, I sent him a copy of my book with that explanation, and he was kind enough to read it and said nice things about it. So I guess, in terms of Dawkinsian point of view, I got the right picture.
That's great.
But because it is, it's like, okay, so if memes were what liberated us from the tyranny of our genes, then what does that mean? What is that trajectory? I mean, going back to, Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is a fantastic book that looks at, I mean, what is his initial question is, why do the white men have all the cargo and us black, brown folks have none? That's his kind of framing question.
Right.
So my framing question is, why do humans dominate the world and have all this stuff, and they're able to do what we're doing now, and no other species can? Why is that? And, the answer is language. And how does that play out? What's the trajectory of all that? That's really the book.
Yeah. Well, it's it's fascinating. Like I said, it's I would say it's in the camp of those books because it's because of its breadth, because you're going into, science and religion and technology. I mean, all of those things are connected to language. So I think to really get, for people listening or watching, to really get the breadth of it, like you should read it, because it's, we can't do it justice in an hour. And one thing go ahead.
Go on. I was just going to say about Sapiens that, because, that's another big broad brush book that looks at sort of, the historical evolution from a sort of history perspective. But he hardly mentions language at all. He does talk about, the big concepts that unite us, but he hardly mentions it. And as I said earlier, he talks about, the conceptual revolution that happened. Somehow something happened and we could do grammar. Great. Okay. I mean, that's like page 1, no further discussion. And the thing that really sort of struck me is that when he comes to talking, because he talks about the agricultural revolution as the second one, fair enough. Nobody disagrees with that. And then the scientific revolution. And his explanation for the scientific revolution is that essentially one day we woke up and realized that we were ignorant. Yeah. And it's like, well, yes, I'm sure that could be so, but it actually happened to coincide with printing. You know, the scientific revolution and printing in the West, in Europe, happened at the same time. So basically you're going from a situation where there were 30,000 books in the whole of Europe, and that doesn't mean 30,000 different books, that means 30,000 just physical books,
right,
in 1450. And by 1500, you've got 10 million books. So suddenly, the dissemination of information, you know, even the very simple but the important early Greek understanding of the universe is suddenly spread out for a vast number of people. And by coincidence, you get a scientific revolution. I think it was probably a lot to do with printing, you know.
Yeah, that's
which is an extension of language.
I think that's one thing that a bit of a tangent, but I do think that we tend to, for some reason, discount technology in the growth or change in culture. So the one I always come back that I always think about, and people, it seems like people just discount it or forget it, is the birth control pill. Was huge in terms of changing, you know, interactions between men and women and possibilities for women and concerns and everything, and changed our culture so dramatically. And that happened, you know, maybe 50 years ago, 50, 60 years ago?
60 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, and it's like, that was a fundamental change in our culture, and we've like forgotten that happened, and that it was, you know.
Absolutely.
And for some reason we discount those things, and we think that the culture just would have evolved anyways, but that's just not how it works. They co-evolve
and the
together.
And the mother lode of that technology is language.
Right.
You know?
Right.
Because it is a technology, but as you said right at the beginning, it's like a fish in water. We just don't even see it. You know, we're just sucked into it, and it's invisible to us. Unless you happen to run into another language, and then suddenly it's like, oh, what's going on? Oh, there's something wrong with them. You know, that's kind of the way it goes.
That's not a trolley. That's a grocery cart. What's wrong with you?
Yeah, what's wrong with you? Exactly.
So yeah, you have a whole section of the book talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll as a bit of an antidote to one of the traps of language that we discussed a little bit, but maybe you could talk about that. And I think you could probably throw, you know, Zen meditation in there as well. But why are sex, drugs, and rock and roll in your book, aside from, you know,
it sounds good.
Some interests of yours? No, I'm just kidding. But
oh no, please. Yes. But well, I just thought to myself. I mean, my wife is Japanese, and you know, nowadays it's maybe not so uncommon for people to marry outside of their, how should I put this, racial type or whatever. You know, it's especially in America, obviously, there's much more of a mixed community in New York, you know, especially so. But when I was, you know, in my 20s, and especially in the context of Japan, it was a huge thing for my family to deal with the idea that I was going to get married to a Japanese woman. It's like, what's wrong? What's wrong with you? So, you know, as I say in the book, if you fall in love across cultural, religious, or identity boundaries, for you yourself, the feeling is, you know, you're dealing with a fellow human here, and there's the rest of it is just artificial. You know, it becomes very clear to you. And so if I'm identifying, which I do in the first part of the book, traps that we fall into, you know, the cultural, the religious, the identity traps, then how is it that we're able to break out of them? Because we do. And the easiest one I could think of was well, I call it sex, but it's the relationship that you have, a sexual relationship, and then choosing a partner who is from a different culture and a different language and a different religion, and that makes complete sense when you're in that.
Mm-hmm.
And seen from the outside, people are going to go, "What are you doing?" Maybe, but it's from an internal point of view that's the escape route from the trap. And so drugs, similarly, anybody watching this who's had any experience with them will know that they are a way of breaking down barriers. I mean, alcohol. Let's just stick with alcohol.
Yeah,
it's a way of liberating yourself. Maybe not always to good effect, but the rules, culture, religion, identity, all these things, they're kind of rules that you learn as you grow up. You may not realize that they're rules, but they're things that you signed off on. And then whatever it is going on in the brain, recreational drugs of all varieties have the capacity to make you question them or maybe ignore them.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of potential there also for realizing the artificiality of the traps that you're stuck in.
Yeah.
So I thought that was another interesting way, especially now we're beginning once again to start looking at the therapeutic effects of psychedelic drugs. I really very much hope that this will continue because it's some of these things are intractable unless you have a way of pulling yourself out of yourself.
Yeah.
Now, of course, meditation we were talking about earlier is one of the classic ways of doing that.
Right.
I mean, every religious tradition has a tradition of quiet reflection, whether they call it meditation or whatever they do. I mean, like in Christian traditions, you go on retreats and you don't talk.
Yeah.
Just cut off words. And drugs, I think Aldous Huxley once described LSD as being a hammer blow to enlightenment. He said, it's like it's not perhaps the safest way of getting there, but it is a way of just busting open all the preconceptions that you have that sort of trap you in those worlds that we're talking about. So that's drugs.
Yeah.
Rock and roll, I'm using that term very loosely to mean anything you get excited by, So sport very much falls into that category. I mean, look at what sport does in terms of uniting the world around something that personally I'm not that interested in, but it's sort of the idea of kicking a inflated pig's bladder around a pitch for 90 minutes seems to excite everybody, and everybody can understand that. And it brings you past those kind of cultural barriers that otherwise separate us. So that's why I put those three things together in the center of the book, for chapter 5, as you said, antidotes. It's like, how do we escape from this stuff?
And I mean, sports is kind of interesting because I was also going to mention that a lot of religious traditions have not only kind of quiet reflection or meditation, but they also have like ecstatic sort of participation that involves music or deprivation of the senses and kind of tries to induce almost a hallucinogenic state in people that and sports, I think, could maybe be that kind of on par with that for some people, where you're just so focused and
put it in the bucket with beer, I think.
Yes, also consumed in tandem, but yeah. But I mean, why? So let's just stick with religions, though. I mean, it's sort of, why do they all have, and why have they independently all evolved these practices? It's because people have realized that they're trapped, and they want to reach some kind of greater understanding of what they are. I mean, call it God, whatever you want to say. They want to be connected more deeply to the experience of reality, and the only way they can do that is to just shut down all the noise, the monkey brain, the chatter, which is both visible in terms of language and invisible in terms of cultural assumptions and norms and everything. And mysticism Yeah.
in every religion takes you outside the headline stories about, in the Bible or the Quran or anything else, and it sort of tries to reach God directly.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting how religions have that sort of dualism, because, as you talk about at length in your book, is, religion can become very dogmatic, and it's based in doctrine and words and, descriptions of things. But then it also has this kind of chaotic, ecstatic, mystical component to it. And those seem to be so like at odds with each other in a way, and one of the, you bring up that, like, sex, drugs, and rock and roll are and those of the authorities are always trying to kind of clamp down on those, because it does take people out of that everyday experience and that cultural conformity.
It makes you ask questions. You ask questions, basically.
Yeah. But it seems like there's this duality in that, and
maybe it's because the religion is such a it's contained the seeds of it contains the seeds of its own destruction, if you like. I mean, it's because it's such an all encompassing doctrine about how to live, follow read the Bible, learn it by heart, do what it says. Leviticus, what is it, 10 pages of who you should or shouldn't be naked with and why, and you just got to learn that and do it. And then some people realize that that's kind of, there's something else that they want to get in touch with.
Yeah.
Because it is an artificial constraint. I mean, there's nothing about religion that comes with, you're not born religious. You have to learn to be religious.
Right.
And so it's a sort of a natural escape valve. I think of it as mysticism. So if religion is a metaphor, it's sort of telling a set of stories and saying, it's trying to say something. Well, that's what mysticism essentially is saying, is that this is just a story, and the reality is actually behind that. It's a much larger thing, but most people don't have the time or the interest to do that, devote themselves to that.
Or maybe also they can, it's that if those experiences that are, just kind of purely awareness experiences without thought are sort of contained within a religion, then that somehow makes them a bit safer. And like, well, that's part of this religious practice, and therefore, you're still following the doctrine, and but we're framing it within that, instead of saying, well, you should just question everything that you know about everything because you had this crazy LSD trip or something, and we,
that makes sense. I mean, I think it is a scary thing to question everything, and that's what happens when people have a psychotic breakdown. So these are not things that are easily messed with, but nonetheless, for me, and then going back originally to why did I write the book, it was sort of looking at how come we are just really clashing over stuff that is common to us all. We've just kind of decided our own little world is right, and just, can we back off a little bit and see that none of us are actually right?
Yes.
We're all entitled to do what we like and enjoy ourselves. That's absolutely fine, but don't make it a religious thing that says my God is right and yours is wrong and I'm going to fight you. I mean, that's just crazy. That's absolutely mad.
I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher. He's kind of a new agey philosopher named Ken Wilber, but he had this great expression, which is that kind of underpinned his philosophy. He was doing another one of these kind of things where he was trying to reconcile religion and science, but he said, not everybody can't be wrong all of the time. And it's like that idea that what, most people are probably wrong about like most of what they think that is they know, but they can't be wrong all of the time. So his idea was, well, we can take a little bit from every culture that they seem to be doing right and kind of reconcile it. And I think that's a really cool idea.
Yeah, and I kind of touch on that at the end of my chapter on religion, saying it's like, it's very easy to laugh at religions if you're a sophisticated, hip, urban kind of a person. You go, how could anybody be so stupid? But 80% of the world subscribes to some form of religion, and there must be something within that is delivering the goods for them. It's sort of and maybe we haven't found the right way of characterizing it yet, but there, the sense of belonging to a greater thing than just yourself, I think, is something that is innate to us, and maybe is a property of consciousness that inheres throughout the universe, if one wants to be really grand about it. But these are you shouldn't be. Everybody should be allowed to find their own way. I think that's probably the thing. But on the other hand, there are some things that are just plain stupid. Maybe we ought to discuss those as well.
Yeah, I think that's my take on a lot of traditional practices, is that we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's probably something good there if people were doing this for a long time. If we can sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, then there's something there, but it's probably not going to be the same thing that is the exact doctrine that, is written down. So, anyways, that's probably a good place to stop. I think we could talk about this. I think we could talk about this like a couple more hours, because it's fascinating and it's encompasses so many different things. But anyways, this has really been a pleasure to talk to you, and I really enjoyed reading your book. Where can people find you online, interact with you, ask you questions? Where are you in the internet space?
Okay, well, I have a Twitter account which is called Memes Over Genes. I can riddle you that. That's the Dawkins thing. That if you just put Simon Prentis in, it'll pop up. But Memes Over Genes is my Twitter handle. I have a website, simonprentis.net. And Prentis, by the way, is spelled Prentis, just one S, no E's. You'll find it anywhere. And if you're interested in my book, which I have a handy copy of here.
All right.
That's you can get that on Amazon, the usual, and in bookshops if you want.
Thanks a lot, Simon. It's been great speaking with you, and I look forward to see what you're up to next.
Thank you very much. It was enjoyable talking to you.